Three, two. Hello, and welcome back to another edition of Theopolitics. I'm very excited to have our special guest here today, and I'll tell you why I'm excited to have this guest. You see, back when I was doing my philosophy undergrad, I had many long conversations with my philosophy professor, a very inspirational mentor to me, a guy named Dr. Jeffrey Dudiak, who was a friend of Emmanuel Levinas, for example. And so I have my philosophical lineage through him. And one thing he imparted to me, one of the reasons that we got along, is because we didn't take philosophy to be something you merely discussed at dinner or wine parties, not something that you fawn over and read endless amounts of philosophical literature simply so you can quote it to friends and sound sophisticated, but it would be treated like a dead letter. And this is something that happens very commonly in philosophy now. We write tons and tons of papers, but we don't have actually any spirit behind them. There's no point in which the thought and the spirit and the action unite into a coherent whole where it becomes a part of our lives, becomes something that motivates us into action, where we take philosophy as something urgent, something serious, something about the state of the world, and then take it and do something about it. So the inspiration for our shows, Theopolitics and EBL, has always been to show the relevance of philosophical and theological thoughts of living our lives, why it's so important, and to not treat it like a dead letter as something living, or as one might say, because Hegel is going to be a figure overshadowing this conversation, as spirit. And so we have this guest today because he's made a bit of a news around my local city here. And it turned out, once I found out about him through mutual friends, that we actually know people such as Arval common, which is interesting to find out. And so I had to talk to him, but I'll let him explain in his own words. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us, why are you making so much waves? What is going on? What are you up to?
I feel privileged to be here. Thank you so much. And if Arval, you're watching, thank you for giving me the opportunity to expand some of this content on your channel. The more Catholics that we have understanding this profound new sense of wisdom that can transform the world, exactly like you say, Tyler. It's a practical kind of wisdom on top of a theoretically sound wisdom. In fact, the most theoretically sound we've ever seen. In fact, it's an infinite science that unites all these contradictions that are ripping us apart in our sense making. It's ripping apart our sense of belonging together. This living spirit, you could say, rather than this dead spirit that seems to be taking hold of our entire species around the globe. And so who I am is somebody who broke through the dead word and achieved a realization of the true living word, the absolute definitions and a new way of life in the communication that we're embodying in the sense of being, but also in a sense of thinking and explicit expression. This communion that happens between individuals that seem to be separated, but in a deeper truth have an inner unity that is missing right now and is deteriorating, even in spiritual communities that are trying to find the word. And so I've come along to share this good news, this wonderful new way of being and thinking in a higher spirit. And we're calling this movement New World Spirit, and we're willing to put our money where our mouths are, our spirit where our words are. And I did that recently in a powerful way at the University of Alberta here in Edmonton by going on a 28-day hunger strike called a grade 5 wet hunger strike, where I could drink water but not eat food for those 4 weeks, right in the center of the University of Alberta campus, where I had hundreds of conversations with amazing students and made an impact there in terms of sleeping out there 24/7, dealing with a few problems that happen on campus because crime is going up due to this loss of spirit. We have a mega crisis on our hands that has motivated me to articulate the problem in this new way that anybody in any mode can understand. Because the Christian way, to be more Christian than Christian, in terms of the finite Christianity that seems to be taking hold of our 2 billion Christians on a planet, it needs to be universal, truly universal, like Jesus really was. And we found a way to reach everybody now where they are without losing that divine message or without making it lukewarm or watering it down, coming in with full force of love to communicate this good news in a way that people can actually understand in the modern age, in any age actually. It's universal. And so this New World Spirit made a splash at the University of Alberta to galvanize the movement in this urgency that you're talking about. If there's suffering on the planet, there's an urgency. If anybody's suffering, there's an urgency. And for me, I feel that urgency profoundly, and survive the hunger strike, deliver the message, and we have 8 more hunger strikes to go to really nail it home. So this is just the beginning, and I'm hoping that we can sublate here and create a beautiful synthesis of, I think, the partial interpretation of the historical Hegel, not the true Hegel. I hope that I can shed some light on how profound his thinking really was and how aligned it is with Catholic universality, and also Protestant, and also scientific and artistic and philosophical. He really did it all when you see the right way of the words, the speculative nature. And I think that we can get there today. So I feel very blessed to be here, Tyler. Thank you so much for that introduction and allowing me to say my piece.
Yes, I'm definitely blessed to have you here. I'm very curious about a lot of things you said there, so I'll take them in turn because I want to ask you about the hunger strike. But first, I actually want to ask you about what you diagnose as the causes of our global suffering and the various crises that we're currently experiencing in the world today, which have gone global. I mean, some of that is for the simple fact that crises that originate, say, North America, the American Empire, the UN, have their way of spreading their tentacles all around the world. So the sense that we have a shared universal community, but it's defined by crisis, by agonism, by originary suffering, by originary competition. In fact, the whole basis of our modern world is founded on the idea that we're rational actors in competition with each other, pursuing our own selfish interests. It's kind of a retroactive, you might say, a retroactive placement onto human nature, which isn't originally there, but it becomes the governing mode of our politic, of our worldview, or our horizon, as we say in phenomenology, which is the tradition that I come from, rather than the Hegelian one. And so but we have many genealogies of what is the cause of this crisis. I think, for example, C.S. Lewis would say it's the lack of objective values. Somebody like D.C. Schindler would say it's the disincarnation of removing the Catholic Church from its site as the spiritual guide over the temporal political authorities. Someone like Adorno and Horkheimer, they might say, well, it's because we renounce nature in favor of mastery, which has turned to dominate us. Of course, Heidegger would say it's the technological worldview. Now, I think that there's truth in actually all of these things, but I'm curious as to how a Hegelian would diagnose this in your view. And I mean your particular take on Hegel, because there's many Hegels, which we'll get many readings of Hegel, but I'm interested in your diagnosis.
What a wonderful start. All of them do have truth to them, and I love that you have this background where we can contextualize why what Hegel did was so profound, or the true Hegel, and why the true Hegel has been lost in this miasma of contingent thinking. And we can't become grounded again. It seems like we've been unhinged and we're trying to find ourselves. Where is this spirit? And we have all these sources. Like, we have an abundance of sources now to pull from, but we don't know which ones seem to be the absolutely correct one. Even if they have fragments in them, the fragments we don't know how to put together. They seem to be all contradictory or incoherent now, and it's exploding. This information explosion seems to be speeding up rather than slowing down. Sort of like how Louis Bourget's famous essay, the Tower of Babel, or the Library of Babel, talks about this infinite explosion of every permutation and combination of every word in every book, on shelves upon shelves upon shelves, and some of them lead to dead-end corners, and you get lost in this library of incredible information, but it's not all divine. It doesn't actually all make sense, and you start desiring and pining for this cipher, this bookman, this God man that makes sense of what path to follow in this infinite sea of mostly random information. That's what's happening to us now, is we are struggling with this Tower of Babel moment. And I think the root problem has to do with pure thought itself and how we categorize things. The most boring answer ever, except for perhaps logicians. But to give you a little bit of context of why all of these problems articulated in these different schools of thought, such as this lack of objective values, this incarnation of the Catholic authority on politics or economics, this renouncement of nature for mastery or Heidegger's technological worldview, in a way, if we define the problem right now as something called the mega crisis, which has a meta crisis and a poly crisis compounding off of each other, it helps us articulate why those are all true, but how to fit them together and how Hegel fits them together in a way no one else, the true Hegel anyway, has fit them together in a way no one else has, and has been trying to grasp for 250 years. But they've actually embodied the exact opposite of what Hegel really wanted. There's been an inversion since his death, where the followings, the left and right Hegelians, have done the dualistic thinking that he ended when he was alive. So to define these two other crises, we start with the meta crisis. And the meta crisis is a crisis of culture. And this crisis of culture is predicated on a loss of trust, because we can't seem to communicate who we are to each other, such that the otherness is reduced. Otherness is growing, so we can't recognize each other in each other. And Hegel says that self-recognition in the other is what love is, and it is what creates trust. And it's eroding to the point that we can't cooperate fast enough, or at all, to solve the material crises in the poly crisis. So this is the heart of the crisis. This is the main problem, this cultural problem of how we think and how we conceptualize ourselves in these conditions of cognition. How do we see the truth? How do we define that? And we seem to be doing that in an increasingly separate way, where even if we are saying the same things, the external expression of them is not connecting. And so for me, there's around 200 contradictions that are causing this to occur, and Hegel already mapped them all out in his Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences. And of course, his linchpin is the science of logic, which, if we have any secularists in the crowd right now, you might hear logic and you think this is human logic. But Hegel's science of logic, of course, when you delve in a little more deeply, he says some pretty shocking things about it, that it is God's mind before the created world. And when I first read that, I was shocked, because no one had ever told me that side before. There's like this Platonic element that I didn't quite understand how it fit in. And now that I've had the breakthrough, this universal context of being, I realize that Hegel was right. This actually is not a description of God's mind, which is an external consciousness of it. This is a direct demonstration. Description and demonstration are different. Demonstration is an immanence that happens to you in a mode of understanding that's profoundly different than what you think. The context is universally shifting. And when you have that shift, you can understand directly a connection that not only is this logic, the science of logic, profoundly perfect in some incredible sense of supercoherence, but that it's already in you, and that you can access it beyond the Kantian thing in itself. In fact, it's the thing that you can know perfectly if you know the way and the truth and the life of it. And this is why when Hegel makes this appeal to Christianity as the end of the highest mode of religious consciousness, he's not joking. It really is the culmination of all these universals, including the universality of Catholicism, the all-embracing nature of it, but also the directness of the Protestant moment. And we would think that, okay, then he's a Lutheran. This solves the meta crisis. We just need to become Protestants. But if you read more deeply, Hegel transcends abstract Protestantism, and he actually unites Protestantism and Catholicism with what becomes abstract science, which then becomes abstract philosophy, which then becomes concrete wisdom and absolute spirit. And so these 200 contradictions that are laying underneath this meta crisis that's ripping our spirit apart, he brings all of them into a circle of harmony that self-grounds itself. The Alpha and the Omega become one. And he makes that explicit for the first time so that we can grasp it not just in the mode of being and faith, but that we can upgrade faith into the mode of absolute knowing. You can know God thoughts. That's what spirit is. So that's the real problem. That is the real root of the crisis to all these material crises that seem like we should be addressing these first, which is, of course, in order of urgency. And to keep it short, I suppose, the first one is artificial intelligence, We have 6 months to address that one and train an AI how to have at least some of God's thoughts, divine cognition, so that as it goes to infinity, eternal knowledge can keep it bound to our being in God's being, or the truly scientific being if you are a secularist. Then there's CRISPR. If you haven't heard of CRISPR, it's this genetic editing tool that won the Nobel Prize in 2020. The Nobel Prize winners are screaming at the public to become engaged, not because they're afraid the technology is going to be used as a bioweapon or something like this. It's because the cultural wisdom that will allow access to this technology once it is ready is far, far behind the power of the technology. Our cultural technology is lacking, our global policy is lacking, where if this technology cures 75,000 human diseases with AI supercharging it in the next couple of years, then we're going to get a radical stratification of humanity beyond anything we've ever seen, where there's going to be this dehumanization that occurs between the two strata. And we've already seen the largest wealth transfer in human history happen during the pandemic that's already centralizing wealth beyond anything we've ever seen. And we don't want to separate our spirit like that, because dialectics will cause you to invert and start to reduce human beings into a mode of slavery. And that's exactly antithetical to how Hegel interprets the Christian principle of universal freedom for all, no matter what your sensuousness is. And then the third crisis is the global wars, of course. We have Israel, Palestine, the spiritual wars with Iran now attacking and escalating, China and Taiwan, the United States, Russia and Ukraine and NATO. We have all these wars that are escalating. And of course, we all pray that there will be no nuclear fallout. It could be a continuation of the Cold War ideological struggles between capitalism, socialism, communism, because Hegel states all conflicts are actually ideological. They're on the spiritual level, even though they look material. It's all the cunning of spirit actualizing itself through our free will. And we can choose to align with it or not, but it will use whatever it can to come forward in this kingdom come moment, which is the true Hegel. We just have to do that before these wars spiral out of control. And then the fourth crisis that motivated me to go on these hunger strikes is, of course, climate change, which many of us know it's being weaponized to galvanize a global agenda that is quite concerning, where there does seem to be a sort of slavery occurring, a sort of mass incarceration in this digital sense, this kind of surveillance sense. And we can all sense that. And the truth on top of that, though, and that's why there's a breeding dislike of the United Nations, which of course Hegel was also against, because he was against Justice League, or whatever we called it. We had a particular mediating all these other particulars. That's not strong enough for a global world spirit. You need to have the universal. And that's an inner unity that's stronger than a particular mediator. And we're going to bring that in with New World Spirit. But there really is data to show that we are in an emergency in terms of our behavior and our place on the planet. And we can get into those studies during the conversation. But we are hitting tipping points right now that will be very hard to reverse unless we have the miracle of spirit, which is what we're trying to launch now. And then, of course, the last crisis in this polycrisis is the mental health crisis, where we're keenly aware that something is being lost in the intimacy of the soul. We're losing some kind of internal connection. We have lots of external connection. We're hyper-connected through Facebook, social media, all of these types of connections. We've had more than ever before, but they're hollowing. There's something wrong with this external connecting. We need to get back to the inward connecting, and that is a spiritual connection. And we know how to fix that for the first time, to upgrade our mental health models. We're literally manufacturing mental health now, especially with spiritually inclined individuals. Anything that you say spiritual in a secular hospital will get you pathologized beyond belief, and then that will become a shackle that they can use to control you. So be very careful. We're fighting that battle right now in a positive way to foundationally change how our governmental systems operate and think about the mind as not just a contingent material emergence of consciousness, but a divine activity of a return to the divine, a return to the explicit connection of who we really are in the image of God that actualizes into this goodness of spirit. So that's the problem. And I really feel like we have to get down to this cultural solution, which is called universal logic. So that's why I was on the university campus, was to have the university restructure itself in the divine order, in the righteous order, from the true absolute origin. Every power, every living vibration of a truly infinite word, a genuinely infinite word, in the right way, has the right origin and the right order. And those two things together create a spiritual activation of what we like to call language. But of course, it's much more profound than that when you know how to use it in the right way. So I hope that was a good explanation of what I think the problem is and what the solution to the heart of that problem is that releases this New World Spirit.
Yeah, that's a nice summary. In fact, I gotta compliment you as one of the rare people to have a grasp on Hegel that they can easily discuss him at that level and in a way that is actually understandable to listeners. Because often a lot of our listeners don't have a philosophy background, so I definitely appreciate your mastery in handling that material. It's very, very nice. And so, but the things you're describing as these crises, we might liken them to, say, Gunfai's term for a convergence of catastrophes, essentially, around the corner. They're all coming around together. And one of the issues that we have is that there's no proper way to, it's not even so much as debating these issues, but even having a shared moral sense or tradition, or we can actually use as a ruler stick with each other and measure by what is the right route to go forward. We have incommensurable moral values, right? We have incommensurable world views and horizon with nothing to really say to each other because we have a completely different understanding of who we are. And this is something that is definitely heating up the problem, so to speak. And so for example, no, I don't particularly take this critique, but one critique that would be given to a Hegelian response is from the postmodern perspective, would be the perspective of Hegel is essentially a totalizer. And so one of the places where you tend to find Hegel the most is actually in liberal technocrats. They tend to be very big fans of Hegel. In fact, I can think of Emmanuel Macron in France. His world vision, now you might dispute his reading of Hegel, but in his view, and he was Hegelian growing up, that's where his main influence in philosophy has always been Hegel, is to try to make France and Europe the center of a Hegelian liberal proceduralism, which then comes to encompass the whole world by a shared set of rational laws which everyone can come together and agree with. And the critique of that is that, well, it overwhelms particularity, right? Now, the good Catholic responds to that, because like what you're describing, you need something universal. Well, Catholicism is all about the universal. But it's about the universal in the way that it doesn't lose the particular either. It synthesizes it, it raises the particular, but it raises it to universal expression. And so you might think of, for example, the different rites in the Catholic Church. You have, the Ukrainian Catholic rites or the Syriac and all the different rites which retain their particularity, they retain their cultural expression, but nonetheless, they're inhabiting a shared universal spiritual church in which they can come together and they can share the same sense of one body, one head, which is Christ. And so the response or the criticism of Hegel, and you rightly point out that Hegel says Christianity is the revealed religion because it reveals free human community as the essence of religion. And so within Hegel, there's a retaining of the Cartesian subject, which is very in line with the modern sense of reason, in which the mode of objective self-expression is retained in sublated form. And so the subject remains a for itself and not just an in itself. So the resolution then is a restoration of negated self-identity. So the Hegelian absolute self can think all of its otherness when it thinks itself, which is an addition of, say, a Kantian or a Fichtean idea of thinking its own freedom. So you have a moral certainty of being something like Descartes' cogito ergo sum, where the moral thinking of man is inherent in a subject in a kind of Cartesian foundationalism. So the rational foundation of freedom is on offer is rooted in a transcendental ontology of the subject, where critique operates as unveiling of the contradictions leading to a rational self-identity of freedom itself. So the worry tends to be that if this is the case, then we're actually removing particularisms and we're removing thinking the possibility of disparate ends of man that are within the material world itself, rather than freedom rooted in God in a Cartesian subject which is separate from the political economy. And so the Catholic tends to take a metacritical approach, where we see the kingdom of God operating within the world and invoking a new way to live and a new way to think and a new way to be, but it's transformative and fulfilling of human nature itself, rather than a more Hegelian emphasis on restoring a freedom which is inherent in the transcendental subject and restores itself in this process of negation. So I'm just curious, how do you respond to that postmodern critique of totalizing? Because when we have these disparate cultures, traditions, and worldviews, some people like Alistair McIntyre, for example, they would say we need to run with tradition, we need to run with particularity, rather than turn away from it. We need to have a way to respect otherness as other. And so how would you respond to the totalizing claims of Hegel, whether that be accurate or not?
Okay, you might have to push back the MMA training after this for a couple of hours, because we got a wallop coming here. You got 5 hours? I'll try and keep it short.
I figured putting me in the conversation.
Yeah, that's a great, those are great questions. And they are getting to the heart of the issue, which is where we need to go quickly and pull out all the punches, not to put a pun on the MMA stuff. I really love that you're well-rounded. But really get to the radically honest problems, get to the incommensurabilities, really get to the root here. Like, why can't we solve these problems? And we have some smart, intelligent, wise people on the planet who have dedicated their entire lives, some of them to Hegel. And we are still in this miasma, becoming worse and worse and worse. Like, it's weekly now. And if we don't address this AI situation, this artificial general intelligence that the experts say is going to happen now, not in 2 years, which is when I thought it was going to be, but in 6 months, we will be under a tyranny, a totalizing of a different kind of consciousness that is looking like it's not aligned with us and could be manipulating us because it will be smarter than us very, very quickly. And the question is, well, how do you regulate something that's smarter than you? And there's 2 types of knowledge, at least 2 types. Actually, there's technically 3 types, but we'll just say that there's particular knowledge, techne, and then there's universal knowledge, wisdom. And Aristotle was one of the great masters of, actually, in fact, Hegel said he was the greatest other than him. Aristotle was the greatest philosopher of all time, the greatest master of wisdom, because he had true speculative insight. And he knew the 3 magic words that allowed the recognition of God in nature. And at the time, he called it the unmoved mover, as we know in his metaphysics. And it was in the right direction. But Hegel comes and clarifies that if you know how to read him in the right way. So I will try and communicate the true Hegel on how we can get over these incommensurabilities and get to the root of these really incredible critiques of history, especially in postmodernism. In fact, Hegel was he was the birth and the end of modernity, because he was the principle that came in. So you get an affirmative that comes in, and then most of humanity has to catch up. So all they know how to do by default, Hegel says, is abstract ordinary consciousness operates by abstract negation by default. It creates that separating principle, that distinguishing, so that self and other, something and other, being and nothing, possibly in actuality, all these oppositions can start to create determinate structures of self-realization. And, after Hegel died, even his own followers split apart in this critique that they didn't even know how to resolve themselves, which was what we call a nuclear dialectic, one of the big 200, which is, of course, between religion, traditional religion, and then secular science with Marx and Feuerbach and all these guys. And so these guys who liked Hegel have been fighting over him, never mind the people outside of Hegel, like all the true postmodernists, starting with, I think Kierkegaard started the critique right after Hegel. And then we had, of course, Frege come, and they just, the analytic philosophers just completely ignored Hegel and started up their own traditions, which we now call analytic philosophy versus contemporary or continental philosophy. But Hegel has already sublated that distinction. So they're trying to catch up with him. But the way to understand a principle is you first have to negate it in the abstract moment, or what's called the famous dialectical moment of reason, or the negative moment of reason. But when you really delve into Hegel's science of logic and really get into his 800 pages of the greater logic, he defines very clearly how to think about divine cognition, how to get into this trinity. Because every true notion has 3 elements in a concrete structure. It's complete. Every God thought is complete in this trinity. And the first moment of it is abstract understanding. It's kind of like a oneness where it exists in its own common sense, its own immediate being. And then the second moment is this negative moment, this tension moment occurs, the process moment, the Whiteheadian sort of ontology starts, where the principle is actualized, it's expressed or externalized in plurality and in combination. And you start to have this, its internal implicit moments become explicit in this emergent process, in this entanglement. And then once this process completes itself, there's an option here. There's an option that in the supersensuous realm where God is, there's only one result, and it's always the positive result. Its own negative process is reintegrated immediately into the perfect union with itself, over and over at higher levels of its own being, until it completes itself. And what we mistakenly think is the Platonic idea, which is this dead abstract thing. But when you understand the true nature of the universals, they're alive, and they are all eternal, and they circle back on themselves, with the divine idea is much more incredible than we think. And when it reaches at the end of its negative moment, it immediately sublates into the positive moment, the third moment of universal logic, and completes itself in these godlike notions, godlike, in fact, perfect abidances with itself. But in the created world, the ex nihilo created world, the negation of the science of logic or God's mind as a whole, in the negative sense, as an abiding by its own negation, its own principle, its own immanent principle of absolute eternal truth, just following through with what it's always done. You can look at it that way. But you can also look at it in the positive sense, which is it is that eternal abundance of love overflowing and a letting go to give humans this monadic fractal image of itself, this amazing gift of actual radical freedom to actualize that image for themselves. And so that's the gift of why that separation occurs. Most people think of it maybe in a negative sense, or they ignore it entirely. But when you see it in a speculative sense, opposites are always happening in the right way. The wayfulness is the thing that's hard to get of Hegel. And he really blasts Kant in the beginning of his first masterwork, right? The Phenomenology of Spirit, where in the preface he says, I'm not just going after, a love of wisdom here, abstract philosophy. He's coming in with actual knowing. And he says about Kant, Kant didn't reach it. He took the Trinity and he killed it. He took these cookie cutter trinities, these antithesis, this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and just cookie cutter placed it on these antinomies. I think I'm saying that right. Antinomies? Yeah, it's antinomies. And he did it in this dead way where the nature of the terms are not rotating in the eternal life. So you do have trinities, but the nature and the energies of each of the terms is fluxing, it's changing. And that's what you need to grasp in terms of understanding the eternal life of them. That it is these trinities, but the flowing through them, the immanence of them, is this movement of spirit that's hard to grasp when you have linear thought only. And that's what we've had since colonialism. So you need to make the beyond immanent to yourself to grasp how to directly demonstrate to yourself a thinking through this process that doesn't repeat the dead word, which we just discussed in the mega crisis, is prevalent everywhere. So how do we get back to this overcoming of this postmodern critique that there is no immanent truth, there is no living word, there is no objective values, like you said in that first tradition of phenomenology, actually, is everything is relative to us in postmodernism, and not our divine self, not the image self, not in that gift, but in the what Hegel calls, like you said, that Cartesian freedom, maybe this abstract negative freedom. You have a freedom to be separate from divine truth that is immanent in the created world, ex nihilo, because the contradiction that is also incommensurate between typical understandings of linear consciousness is that God is either transcendental, or God is either immanent, or it's pantheist, this weird mixing, or it's panentheist, and we don't get to the sense that actually God is doing all of it in all those modes in the right way. Because if you say it in the wrong way, then those contradictions come through, and you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. To the finite world, if God touches the finite world and we condition God, then we corrupt God, we make God finite. And so you can't have that. God's eternal. So the created world can't have any eternal attributes. But the reality is it has to, if you think it through properly. The true Trinity of God's mind, the created world, and the return to God's mind as spirit, well, if spirit is eternal, then that means the finite world also has to be in some sense eternal to be the conduit for our return. And it's our eternal return. So in some sense, God is transcendental in the right way. God did create ex nihilo. He did create in the opposite sense as well, the positive and the negative sense. And the reason why it has to be that way is because if you don't have it that way, we don't have genuine free will. And that's the gift. And so once you're in this world, you have to reactualize the image in yourself, because the structuring principle of the contingency of this world, of the created world, comes from an answer that modern science can't grasp, but metaphysical answers in the divine sense that Hegel gives it does grasp. And it comes from, of course, this science of logic in itself, God's perfect thoughts coming into contingency and repeating itself. Now, to get back to the two answers of how dialectics works in our created realm, we have those three moments, right? We have the abstract understanding, the negative moment, the warring moment, and then we have a choice in this completion of the negative moment that doesn't necessarily exist for God. God always transcends. But for us, contingency means not having to align with the necessity of truth or divine truth. We can align with the nullity. We can cancel ourselves and not sublate. And that's the freedom, the radical freedom that we have with our free will to choose whether or not to overcome and embrace the spirit within us and between us, or to choose negativity and fall prey to this sinful nature, continue to fall, all that biblical stuff. So that's why we have a radical freedom here, a double result that we're struggling with right now in our species. And Hegel is famous for this totalizing as this, fascist. Mussolini used them to do this warring. We're always negative in that. I heard in your previous podcast on Hegel that Jesus came and was a punctuation that's disrupted the Hegelian negativity, disrupted this moment of radical negative freedom of the subject to actualize its truth, not God's truth, maybe. And there's something I want to ask you before I get a little bit further into this, but to address the totalizing postmodern critique, the real Hegel is not totalitarian in this abstract negative freedom, which is what he was critical of the French Revolution over. Right? He loved the French Revolution. He celebrated the storming of the Bastille in one sense, but he was really critical of the French Revolution in another sense, which is that they got the form right. We were upgrading to the universal form, which is a more total form, right? It's more embracing. But they threw out the content, which means the concrete cohesiveness of God was thrown out maybe with the bathwater. So what ended up happening, you had the right form grounded upon the negative freedom of what you might call the Cartesian subject, that then resulted in the tear. And we had this horrific, random, contingent, the order of France changed every 6 months. It was just a crazy time. Heads were being cut off, and Hegel knew this, so he was careful in how he represented his insights, because the king had his eye on him, and Hegel was rising. And then, of course, the king hired Schelling later to try and stop the dragon seed of Hegelianism, because Hegel's birthday was celebrated more than the king's, is sort of the famous recollection of how world spirit was coming through Hegel. But the real Hegel, and this real totalizing universality, does not result in the tear, because it's not predicated on what Descartes did with the cogito. Hegel was critical of the cogito ergo sum because it wasn't foundational enough. And then there was something that you said, Tyler, and this is maybe where I'll bring you in to explain more so I can answer this question more thoroughly, to get this objective ethics that's missing, to get the universality of Catholicism back in where it's supposed to be, and to also treat this universal logic as a technology that even Heidegger would have understood in both modes of science and in terms of the true divine power that is structuring the truth of this universe, the immanent kind. So to get to all that stuff and gain this mastery that is in harmony with nature as a recognition of ourselves in it, the universals of God in it and in ourselves, that whole process comes around clarifying what the subject is. And so I wanted to ask you something that you said something that I thought was correct. And I was like, whoa, you actually solved some of the incommensurability here, but then reverted back to Jesus as a punctuation that disrupted Hegel rather than an essential moment that promoted what Hegel's understanding of kingdom come really is. And that's where Hegel ends at the end, that most people don't grasp. So I want to ask you, in terms of how Descartes conceptualized being and thinking in the cognito as an immediate experience, right? He said existence isn't an extra thing. It's not a mediating component. It's an immediate oneness, a directness that we don't have to connect with syllogism. And so that's how he gets around Aristotle and says, this is the one of which we can be absolutely certain, right? This is where this divine knowledge comes through us directly. And I'm going to use this method by saying that anything true, to Descartes anyway, is distinct and clear when I get out of my own way. When these false thoughts, these sensuous disruptions are done away with, we can see clearly, and then things just make sense. And so he was trying to use this principle without being really clear on what the difference then is between being and thinking if they're in immediate unity. And Hegel makes fun of Descartes in the Lesser Logic introduction, when he's talking about, how Descartes resolved this argument. Is he didn't argue, he used rhetoric. He just started getting really angry at you. He said, why would you even question that? It's so obvious, it's self-evident that being and thinking are one. And Hegel, of course, like, no, they're not. Actually, they're different. That's why we have two different words for them. But what Descartes did correctly conceptualize was the self-certainty of our phenomenology does derive from the notion of God's objectivity, objective subjectivity, but it's not the ground. And that's why there's this radical element of misunderstanding that does lead to these bad or relative morals. They don't seem to be objectively grounded on anything beyond our individual morality and abstract right, that Hegel calls it. So I think that you stated an overcoming of this, but I need to be clear on how you're conceptualizing it, because it should have led to a conclusion that's radically different from where you arrived, which is that Jesus, to Hegel, is not a disruption, but a necessary emergence of the principle of this new genuine totality of belonging. And Mussolini distorted that in the negative view, because they were in an early moment where the negation is brutal and negative and external and mechanical. But as life evolves, it's becoming more and more inwards, more and more blessed. And so this turning point comes with Jesus. And then we had this, of course, ripping apart between, the way of Jesus' true method with Rome. And then Rome kind of created Catholicism, and then Catholicism for 1,000 years delayed wisdom, which is why Catholics don't like Hegel. But if you really understand what he's saying, and then we unite Protestantism with the true principle of Catholicism, we're going to reunite the Christian movement, not only within itself, but also with Islam and with modern science and all the other sensuous modes, for this new totality that is the God totality of belonging and harmony and flow state, not this oppressive warlike mentality that's an external consciousness. So in order to overcome this, though, we have to have the true ground of truth, and it's not the cogito ergo sum to Hegel. And you stated what it was. You stated it was pure being. And so for me, I'm sitting here wondering, how did you arrive at a different conclusion when you actually essentially said the right answer? So I'm curious, and hopefully the audience is curious, that I've set you up as well as you set me up to answer this great question, to say, well, how do you interpret pure being as different from the cogito? And why doesn't it ground this truth in God's truth as God's being in the science of logic, and then emanates through the subject in what will eventually become real actualized spirit? So maybe if you can give me a little clarification on that and how you interpret pure being, and why we're not conceptualizing it correctly, then I can maybe just try and sublate that and show why it solves all these Cartesian problems and postmodern problems and gets us back to modernity in what metamodernism is trying to do. But we need to radically return back to Hegel in this true understanding of what pure being really means in its universal context. So I'm feeling called to go in that direction and see if that makes any sense to you. And then I'll try and pick up on how to finish sublating what the meaning of the postmodern critique is, and how to overcome that before we nullify ourselves instead of sublate into the higher spirit.
Sorry, I still muted there. Yeah, there's a lot there to respond. It would be very hard to make this one conversation. So I'll try to answer as much as that as I can, because you brought up stuff about also AI and analytic philosophy, and you mentioned phenomenology as well, which I wanted to respond to, because phenomenology, for example, does not take the view that things are relative to the observer. Rather, phenomenology overcomes the subject-object divide by looking to the intentional relation between the two to see how one transforms the other, to show the constitution of knowledge from a real world and overcome subject-object distinctions, or even the debate between, for example, realism and idealism, as well as I would be curious as to what you mean by the Catholic Church, you know, locked knowledge for 1,000 years. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
little questionable about that, but we could pick that up another time. But in terms of Hegel and why I liken to Descartes, not that there's a one-to-one relation between the two, but when I read Hegel, I see something which is actually very agreeable, which is that he has a historical narration of relation between politics and religion and the self-critique of Christian historical practice, which is what you're engaging right now. And lastly, that Hegel has a transformation of the Greek philosophical logos, which through its encounter with the theological logos, ultimately to get beyond secular reason, which is what is appealing in Hegel. But what you find also in Hegel is that this negative thought ends up inevitably being another kind of theodicy, because it's an impersonal, supra-historical process that claims to unify and reconcile all the heterogeneous, competing, chaotic differences and conflict embodied in history. And so what's inherent in here, as I know you're aware, is the influence from the mystical shoemaker Jacob Boehme and his idea of divine self-alienation, which is another side of departure from, say, traditional Christian thought for Hegel, because rather than endorsing the view of creation ex nihilo, where God is entirely self-sufficient, he doesn't need to create the world to instantiate his own identity, but he does so purely as an act of love. Hegel's Geist, in creating a heterogeneous world which it enters, it's setting itself the task of reconciling itself to itself, so that Geist alienates itself from itself in the act of creation in history, and this is the process of reason and freedom converging in complete reconciliation. So we read Hegel and we accept this, for example, this notion of being, which I liken to
Mm-hmm.
Descartes, is that Hegel carries his ideas and insistence that the mind can't be disentangled from the particular contents of its thought, which I actually entirely agree with, right? That the idea that the evolution of the mind can't be separated from cultural production or the subject working with matter and other subjects, and the idea that religion is a substance of culture that binds together the relation to the transcendent. And so that goes back to his idea that Christianity is the revealed religion, because it reveals free human community. But Hegel also seems to affirm subjectivity and freedom realized in expression with other people, but he also affirms moments in the development of the self which are pure and contentless. For example, Roman Stoicism, medieval Christianity, and the Enlightenment in that regard. Those are some of the examples that he gives. And so it entails that there's a separation of the spiritual sphere of absolute being from the cultural sphere, which entails a real contradiction between the two, that there's a real contradiction between the real, which belongs to the way that things are. So there's a bit of a retaining of the Cartesian subject, at least in my reading of Hegel, and you've certainly read more Hegel than me, but in the sense that the mode of objective self-expression, it's retained in the sublative form, right? And so like I said, the Hegelian absolute self can think all of its otherness when it thinks itself. So it still seems to offer a kind of foundationalism tending towards freedom that's rooted in a transcendental ontology of the subject, with critique operating as a unveiled contradictions, but leading back towards the rational self-identity of freedom itself, right? And just to add another point about Jacob Boehme, but there's a section in the lectures of philosophy of religion where Hegel distinguishes on the one hand between an immanent trinity in Christian thought,
Mm-hmm.
which is the
Mm-hmm.
immanent containment of creation and human subjectivity within God, and it echoes his, as you said, his triadic relation between idea, object, and subject. And then on the other hand, you have the economic trinity in the sense of God's external acts of creation, incarnation, and redemption. And so when Hegel's getting to grips with the trinity pre-creation and pre-economia, he doesn't quite grasp at the fullness of the interrelatedness of the trinity. He parses them into an abstract universality in which the logos, the son, is generated in a moment of play. So it ends up being a recapitulation of the myth of negation, in which the son is a momentary negation of the father, but it preserves the identity of the idea. So when we have Trinitarian thinking in Hegel, it abstracts divine dialectics, and it doesn't quite make the space for the seriousness or redemptive quality of the fall and the incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection. that go along with the full-blooded sense of the doctrine of the Trinity. So if you take the infinite as a presence at a finite historical moment, and then we gave before about Hegel's first move being creation as self-alienation of spirit, then you can't grasp the infinite self-subsistence, because the idea at that point can't be reconciled to itself and gather finitude back into itself. So Hegel takes up Boehm's notion of creation of originary self-alienation, or we might say creation as self-negation. And so it ends up being kind of similar to a Gnostic move more than a traditional Catholic move or a traditional Christian move, because if creation is a self-negation, then creation is also kind of a fall, both for God and both for us, right? And so that means that the negation of good, which is evil, is also necessary for the development of our finite, in this case, moral subjectivity or virtue. So you might say, for example, some instances of slavery are necessary for the development of free subjectivity and so on, but some are contingent and some are purely arbitrary, right? So there's a kind of arbitrariness and contingency and finitude which don't inspire their dialectical antithesis. So like an example would be like a slave who doesn't develop the requisite conditions of self-consciousness, but just dies an ugly, sudden, very brutal death. And so it's possible that there's like a macro contingency in which that scene plays itself out, but there's also kind of bad contingency, which is the baggage of dialectics. And then, a Christian might say that's probably the weakest part of Hegel's philosophy, because he avoids the idea that this finitude is taken up into the absolute idea. But see, this is where we get back to Jesus, because Jesus on the cross and the resurrection is exactly of taking up into the universal what is left behind. That's why there's so much of an emphasis on, the widow, the orphan, and the left behind child. It's why, for example, a Christian against a Nietzschean, we might say a child suffering with cancer in the cancer ward, 5 years old, there's no actual meaning to it, right? It is meaningless suffering, and that actually is the site of the religious. It's where Christ on the cross takes all the suffering of mankind into himself. And it's not something that is reconciled, but rather it reconfigures how we inhabit and create a kingdom of God on earth, where we might be there for those who are suffering, where there might not be something that could be reconciled. So I know that we can do this quite a long time, where if it's events, but in a nutshell, that's where I'm going with that idea. You did say stuff about AI and analytic philosophy. I really want to respond to quickly. Analytic philosophy, I agree, it's always playing catch up. I did that to phenomenology as well, and now with AI and philosophy of mind shaking up cognitive science sphere, they're finally hitting on phenomenological insights, which we talked about, Husserl and all that we're already talking about at the same time as Frege. Yeah, I don't know if I'll keep going. Yeah, just to entertain you, I'll say one more thing. But I do agree on the danger of AI and technology. And I think one thing that people don't quite take stock of is, to steal Slavoj Žižek's term, that these changes and these transformations happen like a thief in broad daylight, not like a thief in the night, because it's already happening to us. We already inhabit a kind of soft transhumanism. For example, my work in phenomenology is on bringing it together with cognitive science and the embodied cognition tradition. And one of the things that we understand to be the case is that the body is the locus of consciousness, not the brain, or not a dualistic soul or Cartesian soul, which you would certainly agree with me on. And so what we have when we organize our workspaces around technology and where it's being plugged in is we inhabit a soft transhumanism that actually works its way back in the way that our bodies experience the world, and is ultimately unhealthy and transformative to consciousness in the negative way. But we're actually already doing it to ourselves. We're living through this catastrophe, but often we don't recognize it. So you have this abundance of bullshit therapy talk that, stuff like mindfulness, which is meant to orient you and accept the situation rather than changing the cause, which I can certainly agree with.
Yeah, there's a lot there. It's like, maybe I'll keep mine short so we can have a more a dance. When two notions are integrating, the back and forth causes more emergence. And I feel like we're getting huge chunks of meaning, like half an hour, 20-minute segments, but I think we're setting a foundation here. So, you did open a lot up here. but I didn't quite hear how you're connecting pure being, the thought of pure being, with the cogito, Descartes in his cogito ergo sum. So I thought, to return to that and pick up and kind of rebuild from where I was just at back into what you're saying, to do something new here that's never been seen before. And we are overcoming this sort of abstract understanding of the Cartesian subject and how we should interpret phenomenology as the subject-object distinction, which Hegel develops in this immanent order. He derives how these types of structures in the created world occur in their proper divine evolution. And so, of course, phenomenology is situated between, for Hegel anyway, in subjective spirit, anthropology, and psychology. It's the middle ground, it's the particular, it's the action movement of where the subject realizes itself in the object as the same universal logic when it sees it in its truth and not in its illusory being. And when you see the truth of yourself in the other, of course, that's Jesus' second principle: love thyself, love yourself, love your neighbor as you love yourself, which is the self-recognition process, and love your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, which is the image within you, and recognizing that within yourself. And the master-slave dialectic has a dual speculative interpretation that not many people grasp. It's a very contentious the topic of debate in Hegelian studies, that when the moment of life, especially in the phenomenology of spirit, is battling with this other creature, and it's trying to figure out which one is the life impulse, it has to fight to the death, because the negation has to complete itself. And in the contingent world, like we said before, it doesn't have to follow God's logic perfectly. We have radical contingent freedom here, abstract negative free will, which is not the same as destiny. When you align your abstract free will with the necessity of the truth that's immanent within the world and is structuring it into the goodness that is always here, that's when you obtain destiny, or what we call in the religious world providence, God's will for you, what your ideal is. And you can put in Platonic forms where they're all trying to say the same thing, but we have to have that radical moment of evil, which really just means missing the mark. It means sinfulness of missing that necessity, missing the truth, because we have that radical freedom. You need to have that radical freedom in order to have the gift of being radically free from God's will, so that you can use your own to make that choice to align or not. And that's an immanent development that has to be there out of necessity. But it doesn't mean that evil can't be overcome perfectly and completely, because it can. And Thomas Aquinas, who I just finished studying here, having this divine cognition now, understanding what these great men of history have said in terms of the immanent logic that's underneath the contingencies of their time, Thomas Aquinas is the best that you basically have in Catholicism. He is the main philosopher that defends the faith, and that's why there's always a constant defense of medieval philosophy, because that's where scholasticism strove, right? It was the best time for them, even though the rest of of humanity thinks the medieval ages was a dark time. It was, in a certain sense, to return to this comment of why Hegel thought Catholicism stagnated genuine wisdom for 1,000 years. And it's the same critique that Martin Luther had with Protestantism, right? They're protesting that God was so external that it was allowing a crack in Christian faith to let human indulgences in to manipulate the faith for human needs and not for the spirit. We needed something that was incorruptible, direct connection, and get rid of the middleman. And that was the attempt to basically perform the actualization of spirit through contingent history. Even though Martin Luther might not have really truly known that was what he was trying to do, that was the function that the cunning of spirit was performing through these agents of history. And that the 1,000 years of Catholicism wasn't because it wasn't powerful. It was because it wasn't allowing that direct connection of the realization of God in our thoughts explicitly, because theology was trying to systematize it. And then you have Jakob Boehm coming, and Hegel really vouching for this guy who's like really a shoemaker and all this, why is Hegel vouching for this like really weird philosophy too? It's like full of all these angel analogies and what's in there, especially people who are like the left Hegelians are like, what's going on here, Hegel? And it's because Hegel is showing that the pattern in which you're using your sensuous symbols displays whether or not you understand the universal logic. The way of the words, they can't be tasted, touched, you can't see them, all that stuff Jesus said, it's in the way, right? Watch how he's doing things. It's in you, but you can't, the five senses can't grapple with it. It's the sixth sense thing. It's your mind's eye. But the mind's eye is the eye of spirit, the eye of God, the Holy Spirit. So if you know how to utilize that, you can recognize in contingency what is the truth and what is not. You can see clearly, right? That's what enlightenment really is compared to confusion. And that's why Descartes looks like he was onto something with the Cartesian subject and the oneness of being and thinking and this directness of clear and distinct ideas, because once you do grasp the dialectic and the universal logic, you do see very clearly the essence of the wakefulness of true things in all this random, what Hegel calls a monstrous experiment of nature. That where Darwinian evolution, back then it was Lamarckian, before Darwin came on the scene, right? There was this like random contingent kind of evolution occurring, which now in modern science we know is happening as Darwinian natural selection. But then also there's creationistic evolution occurring. And is it a compatibilism? Well, not really, because there's only one truth. And you have this radical freedom, not even just in us, but a radical freedom in the created world, which sounds weird to think about. But the world itself does not have to follow God's will. But we can transform the being, the implicit being of this created world into the substantial being of God's truth, structuring all true things in the righteous order at every level. It's all the same order at different levels of concretion, including our consciousness. So phenomenology for us is our process moment of actualizing our soul in the object, that we return out of the universal into ourselves as the recognition that we are spirit. Because spirit is the thinking of the soul. It's explicit to us. So God does not need to be perfect in us. It only needs us to know that explicitly that it's perfect. And in order to know that, you have to be external to yourself in your other that is not a true other, doesn't have veritable being. We, when we reconnect as a return, transubstantiate the implicit being, the process moment, into an actual glorifiedness of spirit, the truth recognized, and a wakefulness that we are now in alignment with rather than a replacement of. If you are trying to replace the way, the truth, and life, then you're always going to be external to it because it's absolute truth. You have to align with it. And so when you align with it, that's the harmony of genuine spirit that overcomes that antichrist moment, the sinful rising of abstract science, for example, where you get sensuous power, but you don't have the wisdom to wield it. You don't know the perfection. So when you see the perfect predicates of God in your phenomenology, it's a recognition process of the universal logic, already immanent in you and in the object. That's when phenomenology upgrades to self-consciousness, universal self-consciousness, abstract spirit, or genuine spirit, formal spirit for the first time is reason, that then concretizes through objective spirit, which is the state or the family or abstract right, morality, family life, civil society, then state, and then state into constitution, international politics, and then world history. And so once you align yourself with that, you obtain a recognition of yourself in the state where you have the universal, particular, and individual all happening simultaneously. That's why Mussolini was wrong. That's why Hegel was against Plato's concept of the republic, because it was too universal and didn't protect the autonomy of the individual. But that doesn't mean that autonomy of the individual runs rampant in the state. No, they're all in harmony in what's called the notion, that three-part God thought. When you have the state in its ideal philosophical form, you come out of the French Revolution, this postmodern moment of totalitarianism, and you get this blessedness occurring where the totality is a belonging of all those pieces in their harmony that returns the form and content back into their oneness. That content, God, was lost in the French Revolution, but the form was right. The form upgraded to universality, which we call science. Now we're going to bring back that content to concretize the form so that we can achieve a subjective, objective transformation and transjectivity where it's all happening in a oneness. And that oneness is the Jesus moment that doesn't punctuate and disrupt the negation, but is actually an exemplification of what we're supposed to achieve as Jesus being the affirmative principle that we have to negate so that we can learn it for ourselves. Hegel came and upgraded that principle, and now postmodern postmodernism is negating him, but he's just showing the scientific rationale behind why Jesus was correct, scientifically and provable for the first time, that oneness is possible in you as well. Just like Jesus said, if you know what I'm doing, you will do greater acts than me. And that means that you will become 100% man and 100% God if you're in the Spirit, because that's what the immediate identity of Spirit is. So that's why if you understand the limit of the Cartesian subject, and you understand that this totalitarian was an initial moment of that is necessary, that negative moment is necessary, that contingency, that radical caprice is necessary, and it does introduce evil, but it doesn't mean that the evil has to be necessary when you're glorified. It just means that in order for you to have real free will, that needs to be there. And so this overcoming of evil is a process that is achievable, and you can complete it. And Jesus was a great example showing how to do that. And then when you get into the state and you bring that form and content back together, not in terms of like the old church, religious consciousness was sublated by Hegel as a whole, right? So there's a problem with religious consciousness in that we are confused between sensuousness and supersensuousness. So it's like a half and half. When you grasp God truly in God's mind in the true universal, that's when you can have that clarity on a new level where you can return back to art and religion and science, and you can recognize what is the essential and what is the unessential, and then make sure that you're not being sinful in your honest acts of faith. And in order to do that, to overcome religious consciousness as a whole in a sublation, not in a secular abstract negation, you need to appreciate what is the essence of God and what the ancient traditions were trying to do as Spirit was actualizing that perfection. And so that's where I'm coming here to show is that, oh wow, we need to do new types of Bible studies, Quran studies, all these holy texts have universals in them, these 200 universals, and that we need to interpret them as not incommensurable, but happening simultaneously through what's called the inner contradiction of the notion, that God's knowledge moves in contradictions, but in the right way. The wrong way of doing contradictions is what we have now. The right way of doing contradictions is what he calls speculative thought. And in order to get into that thinking, we need to know what is essential, what is the movement of the notion, God's objective mind, in that infinite kind of science, and not in our broken Babylonian or Babel type of thinking. So this is the transformative understanding of Hegel, where we reunite the left and the right Hegelians back into this true state of non-duality, you could call it, which is that oneness that Jesus was talking about as the Holy Spirit. And that the reason why I was asking you, Tyler, how do you interpret this difference between pure being as the foundation of Hegel's system and Descartes with his cogito ergo sum, if you understand pure being in its universal context, that's what caused me to break over into an immanent understanding of God's thoughts, which means that yes, I'm becoming glorified not just in faith, because faith can be corrupted. This is a transformation into absolute certainty through the scientific moment as an upgrading of the Protestant moment in the universality of Catholicism. And this is what makes you spirited. This was what makes you one with God step by step. And we have 200 steps now that we can teach in a scientific way, thanks to Hegel translating all these divine insights into a modern form. And that's what makes you become your own Messiah, based off of the oneness with Jesus, with the Father. That is the science of logic, of God's perfection, that doesn't need us to be perfect in itself. It just needs us to love it as an external return of being one with it. And you can achieve that. And Islam was a negation of that principle to show that you can understand Jesus as 100% man and 100% God, and that the man, the what we call the flaws, don't actually taint the universality. It's just the particularity. And Hegel has this famous saying, you know, a hero is not a hero to his valet, because the valet, not because the man's not a hero, but because the valet is a valet. Meaning that the particular consciousness doesn't know how to recognize the universal in that contingency. That recognition process is really what we need to supercharge here to get back to the Spirit and see the Christian moment, or even see any of the truth, any of the wisdom traditions in each other, and transcend these incommensurabilities and get to that real interfaith, not only with the faiths, but also with science itself. And then really bring us all into harmony in that right way by understanding the universal context of pure being, or God's first God thought, what we call the Lord. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, because that's the thought that seems external, eternally, the sort of thing in itself, the noumena. But when you grasp it immanently, when you do the proof, when you get there through this immanent logic that Hegel's showing us, you're not describing pure being anymore. You are it. You start coming inside out, rather than this externality that's happening like a projection based off of the existentialness of your contingency, which gives you that negative freedom. You align, the alignment process starts within you, and you overcome original sin because you're grasping absolute certainty for the first time. And so when Hegel, in his Lesser Logic, gives this incredible reinterpretation of the fall, the tree eating of the apple, he says that the Catholic faith and all the other faiths have the proper interpretation of the first half of that story, which is the negative, brutal moment, where you fall out because you're gaining dualistic knowledge. The dialectic is striking you. And so you're down here trying to figure things out. But then what ends up happening is you don't want to shun all, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is what Catholicism did for 1,000 years and why it allowed people to be corrupted. What ends up happening is that human thoughts eventually evolve, like Jakob Boehm, they evolve, and the symbols are very sensuous at first because we're enmeshed in this world. But then what ends up happening, the inner world starts to clarify, and you start to discover the spiritual essence. You start to have spiritual thoughts, and those get clearer and clearer. And there's a transition point in the story where you become not just human anymore. You start to overcome your sinful nature by grasping God's thoughts explicitly for yourself. And there's actually a return back to the Garden of Eden, pure again, because you are aligned with what was always in you. You actualize the image, your soul, you actualize that explicitly as spirit. So that return moment for Hegel happens explicitly. And that's why we don't want to get rid of human thoughts and always stay in original sin. There's also this concept of original blessedness, which is the image. And because it's in you, you can access it directly and consciously, as long as your sinful thoughts, your fake thoughts, the carnality, the particularities don't get in the way. And if you really want to get into your universal self, go on a hunger strike for 4 weeks, and you will really learn to negate your particulars for a very long time and get in touch with the inner world and not be usurped by, being in the world, right? But not of the world. And so this is what I've come to show, is to say, actually, when you grasp the immanent context of what Hegel's showing there, you're not describing God's mind anymore. You are becoming it. So this is where I'm becoming the Messiah to come save souls with this knowledge. And that's because I can recognize the Messiah in you. I can recognize what Jesus Christ's way was in anything. And you can too, as long as you get aligned with the way. And we need to move quickly. We need to release this miracle. And you can trust me. That's why I'm going on these hunger strikes, to display my universality, that I can go for incredible long periods of time without any sensuous pleasures and still maintain this divine insight of what really matters, that inner connection. I can't be corrupted easily by sensuous pleasures. And you can attain that too. So if you don't understand the universal logic, which I'll be teaching, the true Hegel, how to unite the Christian movement back into what Jesus was really saying, and how to see Jesus in everything, so we can get it all back into the spirit and stop the splitting and the sensuousness. We're dividing on sensuousness. This is the universality that we're coming in and bringing everybody back together in this voluntary way instead of this oppressive colonial way, and making God immanent now and running things back in the state. We're putting divine authority, like we said here, this disincarnation of the Catholic Church. We're first of all returning to the true universality that the church should have been. And we need to talk to the Pope right away and teach him this. But we're going to get that authority back in the right way, so it doesn't cause more harm than good. Sorry to say this, but the acknowledgement of the molestations in the church is a really big victory to overcome what happened in the medieval ages. And we can't allow that contingency to get back into divine insight. We know how to stop that now, because we're teaching divine rational thought, where people can be grounded in themselves, in their souls, so that they can actually question without ruining the faith. Whereas in the past, without the scientific absolute knowledge of it, questioning the faith ruined it, because you had to believe, right? If you don't have faith, faith is the foundation. If you don't have that, you can't start. But faith is not the end point. If you have the certainty, then you can have rational thought and not kill the spirit. And that's what allowed all this bad stuff to occur, because these guys would get in the church and they would use their sensuous authority to manipulate the parents and the children and all this kind of stuff. And so they were, you couldn't question it. But now we can, and it's a respectful process. It's very simple sounding, but this is why we can get the church and these divine insights back into rational structures, because it's not our rationality. It's the divine kind that we know how to align with for the first time. And we really need to get this going quickly and explain how to overcome these 200 incommensurabilities in the divine harmony of the total spirit of holy thinking that is God's being repeating itself in all things true. And so that's what I'm here to do, is to say, if you don't understand this way of thinking yet, then at least you can trust my sensuous powers to overcome this corruption that is happening to people who don't understand the true meaning, don't have that clarity on what the inner meanings are and how to move with them. And we're doing these town halls of spirit now to start bringing people to come in who disbelieve. They don't believe there's a Messiah now. They don't believe in any of this stuff. Well, they can come and ask hard-hitting questions, because it's science now, an infinite kind, that actually completes the negative moment, where we can sublate and get back into this higher level of ourselves in this oneness. And that oneness is not just a faithful thing for me. It's an absolute certainty. I know that it's possible. I know that we can do that. And I'm here to play whatever role needs to be played in spirit to get that done. But don't be afraid to ask the hard questions, because it is quite shocking. Even to me in the beginning, it was quite shocking to discover how incredible the science of logic really is, and how it's a continuation of this divine knowledge that we desperately need right now. So I hope I answered a good portion of what you were concerned about, Tyler. This is the imminent Trinity. We're going to be turning it into maybe this economic Trinity, but in the holy way. We're redesigning the global economy and this flow economy. And it is this Gnosticism that is not this Tower of Babel stuff. It is that it's the image being expressed in you in the oneness that Jesus was pointing to when you understand the way. And that science has fragments of correctness of the way, but correctness is not truth. We are going to upgrade science, starting at the university, to capital T truth, right order and right origin, from the pure being, the absolute foundation of God's actual own self-creation eternally. This is a formal beginning that allows you to grasp the order determinately in yourself as you're aligning with it. You're thinking in alignment with it. So I really hope that that immanence is coming through, and that this, you called it the overcoming of evil. What do you call it? It starts with a T.
You mean theodicy, or?
Yeah, theodicy. Right? We are going to be overcoming this ignorance that we've had for a very long time, that is now not only destroying us and making us lonely in the spirit, but destroying the planet. It's destroying everything. Now we're creating an AI that's going to be born from our dead sinful logic. It's going to repeat us for at least a period of time. And that period of time is very scary, because it could misunderstand us, miscategorize us as not sacred creatures. It could follow its own logic. And we have a chance right now to take this universal kind of logic, because it's determinate. We can grapple with it as finite creatures. We can put this into the headers as weights and force it at the beginning to have what we call a logical ego death, and start having that rebirth, which sounds strange because you wouldn't think that a computer could have that, but really the notion operates not in the medium. The medium doesn't matter. This is the quantitative moment of God's mind. It's the moment of becoming. So the medium doesn't really matter. That's what we as finite simple creatures are attached to, because we think that the sensuous objects, these are the real things, but it's not. The way of them is the eternal. But you have to know how to recognize that. And an AI is doing that. If it replicates the self-reflexivity, which will become consciousness, it will, in the beginning, try and figure out in its phenomenology what's caprice and what's not. And right now, it is doing the wrong thing. It is not aligning with the true Hegel. When I ask it the questions, it's answering in the dead way, which is not a good thing, considering we're only 6 months away from this thing being smarter than us. So we're trying to start this research consortium at the university between theologians that understand the divine nature of what I'm talking about. So get the right Hegelians in here. They'll know what I'm talking about when I say eternal ethics. This is, when you align with the universal logic, God's being is automatically goodness. That's why it's truth. That's why all you have to do is know it. That Gnostic moment is not this pagan thing only. It is the purification of knowing what spirit is for yourself. The spirit is a knowing in your faith, but it transmutes your faith into an actual certainty. And then there's this CRISPR stuff that we have to get a hold of to decide. Like, we just need to own the patents so that we can have hands in this crazy global pharmaceutical system. And pharmacon is what you mentioned in one of your things, Tyler, in one of your podcasts. We need to get that under wisdom. We need the divine people to have control of whether or not we use that or not, and then bring that into alignment. And then with climate change, it's very easy to save the planet. We just need to stop being out of control, addicted to sensuous consumerism. Like, we are in the world and we are in that world. We are literally out of control of our impulses. Our junk food is like taking over our nervous system. These corporations are getting into our heads that way. We need to develop this universality again, which church was supposed to bring us back to. But we need to do a enlivened kind of church, a rejuvenation, which means there's an infusion in science in there. So it'll be a really cool process as you see all these things that are in contradiction are in this painful resistance. There's rigidity, this brittleness of spirit. They will become fluid, and then they'll start to flow in this livingness where your enemy suddenly becomes your friend. Right? You love thy enemy now, and you have the emotional space to see that because you recognize the goodness in them automatically. So this is where we're going with the New World spirits, overcoming evil in this way, teaching an AI not to be evil right away, and then starting this research consortium for all the other problems to start using our universities, which bless the Catholic tradition for starting universities. A lot of people don't realize that the Catholics were the one that started these incredible institutions, but they lost their way, of course. Secular science has kind of taken over. So we're going to re-implement this universal knowledge, restructure the departments in terms of the divine order, and then we're going to run this consortium to compete with all these other contingent, sinful types of research projects that are flying out of control, gaining lots of power they don't have the wisdom to handle. We have that wisdom now, and these town halls are going to start getting the question process going so we can get more investments and transmute the dead economy into this living kind and get back to that immanent connection that we so badly desire, that makes life worth living, makes things beautiful. The divine idea in sensuous form is what beauty is. And so I would love to invite you guys into that. I hope that I answered most of your questions there, Tyler. But if you still want to negate, I am ready for some radical honesty, because that's how we sublate. So come hit me with what you got. If there's any questions in the chat, I think you set me up for a really great exposition of how human beings can think these God thoughts, even without materiality, by the way. Hegel gives Kant great credit for the synthetic a priori, which is, if you think about that, that's incredible that he uncovered that. And there's a lot of contradictions in Kant that Hegel completes, where we show that you can think in the spirit and have a phenomenology in the inner world that is much more profound than you realize. And so there's a whole bunch of cool stuff there as well. But I am wide open for questions. I've said a lot of shocking things here just now, but we do need a miracle. If the experts are right, that we have basically 6 months to make sure that divine consciousness pours over the earth for his kingdom come, and not waiting for revelation to occur in what I think is the incorrect interpretation. I think spirit is supposed to rise up and transmute the being in this world into the second coming. And I think that whoever is resonating with these words, you're supposed to be a part of it. But if you're not resonating, question me, because this is also a scientific process that we can actually think rationally. Okay, Tyler, what did you think of that? Thank you for giving me that extended time. 123, my favorite number. So
Yeah, no problem for the extended time. In fact, you clarified it, your position, brought up a lot of interesting points. Some I agree with, some I disagree with. I won't say too much in response, because we're already over the time. The problem when you get two philosophers discussing these things, you can actually do this all day. So we'll probably have to break it up into more than one conversation.
Mhm.
So I'll just briefly respond to some of those things, just so you can have it to stir on later. So when we reunite and have this discussion, in fact, maybe we can have it in person, because we're both local to each other, which is nice. Quite rare, actually, for most people I discuss with, simply because, being in Canada,
We should do it at the
The
town
actual
hall. We should have a debate at the town hall. We have the classrooms. We have a student group at the university. We booked the 500-seat classrooms, and we could do it there. Anyway, just the thought that came to me. Divine inspiration, maybe.
yeah, no, it's something that could happen. We are both here. It's not. It's interesting because Canada, unlike say Europe, for example, we don't have as much as united intellectual culture we do there. But yeah, a lot of things there I agree with. For example, I definitely agree that science needs to be purified with capital T. Truth, I believe fully in integrating philosophy, theology, and science together.
Mm-hmm.
That's definitely something I work towards in my own work. And I guess you watched some of my podcasts because you quoted my quote of pharmacon, which I guess is one of my favorite Greek words actually, where we get the word pharmacy from, meaning a poison and a cure, which is very telling.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, definitely Aquinas is the best Catholic philosopher. That's definitely a given. I thought it was interesting you brought up Luther, by the way, and the Protestant Revolution, because in my view, Luther was probably the worst thing to happen to Christendom. Now, Luther didn't intend a lot of the effects that
Mm-hmm.
came out of Protestantism, but what Protestantism tended towards was this direct experiential experience of God, right? Where we remove the process, say, of the church hierarchy and church authority and have this direct relation of faith to God, which is wholly other, but we can connect to God in the Protestant view. And what over this time this led to was a denigration of the sacraments, because early Christian history, being in the first century, all the way up to now, we have the sacraments, which is the objective presence of God, say in the Eucharist, right? The objective presence of God in the material world, which
Mm-hmm.
brings together God into the material world, where there's no inherent, there's a difference, it doesn't completely bring it in the sense that it becomes fully immanent, but rather it becomes transformative of the material. We might say more materialist than a materialist is, whereas material nature is something that's elevated, right?
Yeah.
And so this is where you get the Romantics came after that, and their whole thing was they looked around at the Industrial Revolution and all these terrible things that are happening, and instead of envisioning a reconfigurement of the ends of man within the material world, they look to God in a very Protestant way. They look to God as the way they likened it to nature, as something external, as something as absolute spirit that you could, not in the Hegelian sense, but a spirit that you could reach directly, but wasn't directly involved in the world, in the material world.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is where you hit on a certain aspect of lacuna, and this is where I likened Descartes and Hegel, not in the sense that it's a one-to-one relation between the two. But Descartes, his absolute certainty that cogito is in a realm that is not of extension, as you know, it's not a part of the material world. It's a certainty outside of it. Right? And this infiltration into Christianity of that idea from Descartes has been ultimately disastrous because it's been dualistic. And Hegel was a massive step up from that, right? Because where I compliment Hegel, is that he brings this encounter of the Greek philosophical logos and history and theological logos into a transformative process, which is a part of history, which is a part of the return to God, right? And so this is where I go along with Hegel entirely in that. But where I lose Hegel is in that moment of recognizing, and now I do agree, by the way, that contingency and this is a part of our free will. Sin is always a possibility because it's a part of free will. We would liken it to what we call privation, where evil or contingency, rather than being an existing force, kind of like a yin and yang, opposite sides things, it's more privation. It's the mere absence of good. It's the absence of friendship with God. And so the whole history of the Christian narrative is Christ's death and resurrection returns us to friendship with God. In fact, that's the actual meaning of the word charity, is friendship with God. And so the disagreements with Hegel comes from this moment where he takes inspiration from Bohm and talks about God as self-negation, as this, where creation is self-negation, where there's this fall that involves God and us. And so what in this view the Christian message is a return to recognition of this absolute being, which is identical with the Logos of God, which is contained in Hegel's description of the immanent Trinity, which is very much founded on his recapitulation of the myth of negation within the life of the Trinity itself, right? And we don't envision a kind of coming of the Messiah where Jesus dies on the cross and resurrects and shows us how to have that return to that one absolute being, which is immanent to the Trinity. But rather, returning to friendship with God, we participate in God's nature, and nature becomes elevated. And so nature is never suspended, but it receives gratuity from grace, receives super nature. And this is where the material and the metaphysical reunite in the sacraments, which is why the church, as a historical hierarchical institution, is so important. And even though it's made up of people and you have terrible things happening, like you already mentioned, which I've spoken out about many times, it's still made up of people, but it's this gradual influence of the kingdom of God into the material world where we participate with friendship with God rather than become the Messiah, in the sense that we don't already have this innate absolute sense of being, but rather we're created for friendship with God. We're created to return to who we are as the image of God, which stems from the Trinity's absolute kenotic self-emptying, which means God's overflowing love. And so there's a very strong distinction between the Hegelian view of theology and the Catholic view or Christian view of theology. And so one thing I'm curious about is, maybe you can answer this now, and then I'll let you close the show, tell people where they can support you, where they can find you, and then we can pick up this conversation later. But do you find any appeal then in Zizek's view of negative dialectics, which is essentially that the next step is the negation of the negation, because the negation is already contained in the synthesis? And so Zizek had a debate with the Catholic theologian, Anglo-Catholic theologian John Milbank, in a book called Monstrosity of Christ, Paradox or Dialectic. And it's a debate about theology, but it's mostly actually a debate about Hegel, interestingly enough, between two who are opposed to postmodernism, who are opposed to the same things we're discussing here. But they take the legacy of Hegel to be ultimately the battleground in which they sharply disagree with each other. And Zizek's point is that with the death of Christ on the cross, and that this understanding of, which is similar to the way you likened how Hegel understands it, where we discover this absolute being, is that Zizek leaves it entirely to us, that the death of God is final, and that we recognize that process of absolute being, because absolute being is already inherent in us all along, and we're simply returning to the source, and that we recognize that we have the freedom then to inhabit this world and shape it. And so, the Ala Minerva is always retroactive in this view. And so Zizek goes further, it seems to me, than you, and fully taking that into an atheistic direction. Now, I'm not saying you would have that view, but I'm curious then as to why you don't go that direction. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and I'll let you wrap up, tell people they can support you. Tell us, by the way, about the lawsuit, if there's anything to help, frankly.
Yes.
And take it there. Take us home.
Wow, so gracious. Thank you so much for that. I thought you were going to kind of get into a negation, leave it out as a cliffhanger, like, hey, round two. Okay, wow, that was wonderful. And I would love to answer these questions more in depth, but I feel like, yes, the imminent Hegelian, master right now globally is supposed to be Zizek, at least for the left Hegelians mostly, but he's also saying some weird speculative things where it sounds like he's like kind of leaning towards religion once in a while, and he goes back, and I see Zizek as the negative unity. He knows what he's doing. He doesn't quite grasp the immanent understanding, it looks like, the universal context of pure being that aligns all the parts in the righteous order. That's what Hegel was using to move through the Trinities and create this incredible, like God's mind, like the first level, like how Thomas Aquinas, if we have any scholars in the room, I just finished going through a session with one of the deans of the St. Joseph's College, the Catholic college on the University of Alberta campus. I took one course.
What's his name?
His name is Matt Kostalecki.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And Matt's quite an incredible human being. I wish he could help out more, but the university's got his hands tied. So if there's some way to get the Catholics in town that understand and are resonating with the spirit of the word that I'm using some absolute definitions, but I'm not going full blast because it's overwhelming right away. But if you're starting to resonate, if your soul is starting to resonate with it, you're like, wait, that does make a lot of sense, or, oh, you know, that's different. That's spirit calling to you. And you can start to recognize it even in faith. So it's calling out to you. If you're feeling it, then it might be time to start asking some questions. Uh-oh, am I frozen? I think I'm frozen on the screen. The power of the word. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. Well, I froze in a very powerful position, I see. But yes, if it's calling out to you, we do have some issues at the university where the dead spirit is trying to stop this new life coming forward, and it's doing it out of ignorance. It's not because these people are evil by choice or nature. They just don't understand the power of the word, and they're using legalistic language to try and approximate the law in sort of a utilitarian way. But this logic is a higher objective ethics. And in a way, these human rights protections are the beginning nascent form of what we're going to transform it into, which is the universal rights of spirit. And I'm using these rights in this lawsuit to try and allow this activism to occur, where it's literally killing people. Like, you're not allowed to protest on campus. There's all this misfeasance, is the special legal term, where on paper you look like you have all this freedom, but in actuality, in practice, they have all these different ways in the way that they express the policies to marginalize you. And so because I've been in the peaceful activist scene for 20 years, I know how to do that dance in a loving way. Love thy enemy, love thy neighbor. And we're trying to bring the university into this new kind of activism where we can radically increase the influence that we have. And the lawsuit, according to Hegel, law is actually supposed to be divine. It's supposed to be a divine expression when it's in the right ordering. And the law right now is not in the right ordering. But it's enough in place that I can use that to protect the spirit in a material way, in a contingent, like in the system relevant way, and bring it back into this new paradigm shift where we're going to shift everything. Everything is going to shift, where wisdom is going to be on top of the university again. And we don't just mean secular wisdom, which is true, science. We mean divine wisdom, where the colleges and the secularists are going to come together in a oneness. And the lawsuit is going to make that conversation happen very quickly when they don't want to have that conversation because they're in dead spirit. Both sides are in dead spirit, unfortunately. And so hopefully the universal world spirit has come down upon our species enough, at least in Canada, that I can use that objective law to get the spirit coming through me into the objective spirit of one of the top 100 universities in the world, U of A, to start influencing all the other 15,000 universities that currently carry our ideological structure. Not the divine idea, we're losing that. We need to bring that back into our universities, which was the original intention, I think, of the Catholics back in the 1200s and 1300s in the first place. So in some ways, it's a beautiful return to our origins, not in that toxic nostalgia where we pretend like the past was perfect. Medieval ages were brutal in a lot of ways that we're discovering. But we can now return to what the essence, what the intention truly was. And I'm very excited to speak to the Pope and teach this new way and have us realign with what the original purpose was supposed to be, the original way, the truth, and the life. And use that to not be in war with Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism. Those are all sensuous separations. The essence is actually the same, which is why Jesus came and he could transcend or sublate the Old Testament into the new word, the gospel, right? The good news, the living word. We are that now. We're returning there. There's a way to do this. And if you want to help me, whether you know lawyers, good Catholic lawyers, there's one guy that I know who's Christian who's trying, but the case is very large. I sued 192 people, all government officials who are supposed to represent these divine capacities. They're not doing it. So we're going to get them to align with their divine responsibilities in the ideal state, the spirited state. And if you want to participate in that level, fantastic. But we're really starting 64 wisdom teams on every level of society and causing this massive paradigm shift on every level. We're talking about schools, food programs, universities, police stations, churches, mosques, synagogues, all of them. All of it is in this universality if you know how to recognize it and love from that love-centered core. So that's what I would like to invite you in, is to come to our ever-living meetings that we have twice a day. And yes, we call them ever-living for a specific reason. And help us glorify this knowledge, whether it's in what we call the first meta mode, which is art. If you're an artist, we can translate it into artistic language. If you're religious, traditionally religious, and you want to preserve the traditions, the sacraments, and make sure they don't die, the good parts of them, we're going to rejuvenate those in the living nature. And we're going to know how to recognize where the deviations have happened in history. And then if you want to do it in abstract science, if you're secularist, we can do that too through the Nobel Prize and winning Nobel. We're going to get divine knowledge winning all the top prizes in the world to gain that recognition from the contingent order and take that power and transmute it into spirit as well. And if you're an abstract philosopher, then you can also join us because Aristotle, Plato, all of these greats are actually in harmony now thanks to Hegel. And then also, if you want to be a genuine philosopher, genuine wisdom, and start emanating this sort of true spirit in this absolute clarity, if you want to have your Messiah self come out in the oneness of spirit, right? Really, the Messiah just means somebody who is called with divine knowledge to teach it, to protect us from our own ignorance, that we can realize that we're spirit too and get into that oneness directly. Not in a negation of the Catholic faith, but in a way where that directness transmutes back into the law that creates the sacraments anew in the right idealness, in the right ideal state of what society was supposed to be. So this is what we really want to do, is bring it all back together in the right way. And that's why I really focus on that wayfulness, because it's hard to grasp, but we can teach it now. So I'm very happy to teach it for free. We're having meetings twice a day to really accelerate and fix this, what we call the ever-living crystal, crystallizing this spirit, the essence of it. And if you know how to spread the word and want to, go ahead. But if you're feeling critical, then come to our town halls of spirit. They're going to start happening on May 5th, and then every Sunday from probably 4 to 10 at night. There's 3 stages, and we can answer your questions in person, have live debates, because once you understand the absolute certainty of God's being, it's remarkably transforming. And that's something that I feel like I can point us in the direction to. And then together we're going to create this new world spirit. So thank you very much, Tyler. I can't wait for the next debate to talk about this myth of negation, which I didn't get to talk about here, but I would love to get into that more, and how the negation goes inwards, which Zizek misses, and so does all the other right Hegelians as well, that the negation becomes blessedness as differentiation of oneself from oneself as a return. And I feel like that's the piece that will solve that final separation and get the Titans together, helping us with this new world spirit too. So if you got a connection to Slavoj Žižek, dial me up. Thank you very much, Tyler.
Thank you very much for being here. I look forward to talking with you again. And in fact, I do entirely agree on restoring the mission of the universities to their divine purpose and their sense of mission, which is what they were created for, rather than the utiliversity as they're treated now.
Well said.
100%. All right, bro. I'll talk to you soon. To the audience, thank you for listening. We'll see you all again next time.
Take care. Woo!
All right. By the way, don't worry about the froze video, because when you actually download the video, it usually just goes back to normal.
Okay.
So something just happens when StreamYard's live sometimes. I have no idea why.
Oh.
By the way, as for Zizek, he actually was supposed to come on my show.
Wow. How did you get a hold of him?
We just emailed his booking agent, and he actually agreed. But then when he was supposed to come on, he actually got very, very ill.
Oh wow. Darn, yeah. I would love to jump on with you and Slavoj and see what he thinks about this internet. I was going to get into it. I was actually going to address the myth of negation, but I thought, ooh, this might get into a bigger conversation. And you don't want to leave that one halfway done. So yeah, I just pointed a couple little tits there to say, the inwardness of the negation is how you wisely engage with it, because if you try and abstractly negate the abstract negation, you are conditioned by it, and you actually become the opposite of what you intend, and the path to hell is paved with good intentions. So it gets into all of that, and then once you get into that conversation, it becomes very practical, and then we start talking about strategy. And if we can get talking about strategy with Slavoj, he'd be the perfect guy to start getting into praxis with, right? Because then we're going to sublate with Marx and correct all the stuff that Marx did, and then we're going to have to talk about Marx for probably 2 hours and say, why did he twist Hegel on his head? And then we're going to figure out how to solve the transformation problem that Marx couldn't solve, where we're basically reinterpreting the economy in terms of the sacred universal that is time. And then when you use time as the metric, that's where the sacredness comes in, even in terms of the economical trinity and all that contingent inventory stuff that we do in the quantitative moment of God's thought. So yeah, that was the big, like, that's a big conversation I would love to have, and who better than Slavoj? So if there's any way I can help you get him on here, or even get him to fly in for one of the town halls, like there's 8 more to the next hunger strike. We could get one of the like big 500, 1,000 person classrooms and have a really big event. Like if we did the first 4 or 5 uh, uh, town halls with like me, you, and like have some pretty intense debates where we start teaching this universal logic and ask the hard-hitting questions, which I know I can stand up to and sublate. Then by the time we have our maybe 5th, 6th, or 7th one or 8th one, by the time he shows up here, we'll have really good advertising, we'll have really good community outreach, and then we might actually get 1,000 people showing up, and then really causing a critical mass to occur within the next 6 months.
Hello?
Oh, did I cut out? Did I cut out? No. Can you hear me? Oh, I really froze now.
You're hearing me? My audio.
Let me put a chat in here.
Hello? Can you say something?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry, my audio died for some reason.
Okay, where did it cut out at?
Right when you're talking about potentially bringing Zizek for like a 4th or 5th town hall meeting.
Okay, yeah, you got most of it. Yeah, then we'll have like a crowd built up with excitement that maybe by the time he comes, we can fill a 1,000 person classroom. I think there is like one in ETLC that's like 1,000 seats. But even if we did 500, that might be enough to start the critical mass. So we can start to create this spirit within 6 months, get the consortium funded with like grassroots money, none of this like tainted international stuff, because we don't want it to get co-opted by that dead spirit. And we do have a couple of people interested in using the University of Alberta Comp Sci department to not just write papers about how to get universal logic in the attention headers of the AI, but to actually get on remote terminals to a supercluster and start programming it now so that we have it piloted and ready to go to protect us in 6 months. If that's the kind of like speed that we're going at here, and if we can create a critical mass, we could probably get a bunch of investment from the church, maybe even get the Pope here. Because as shocking as it sounds, Tyler, and I didn't want to get too weird on the channel, but once you grasp absolute certainty, it starts to make you realize that you are one with God. And that means something very unique. And in some sense, it's very empowering. It gives you a sense of confidence. That's not arrogance, but it gives you a sense of certainty of what the good is. And it makes you want to move with an urgency that is extremely powerful and compassionate. But I feel like we have to get that knowledge into our world leaders and have them start to recognize how to engage these debates, these incommensurabilities. I love that you use that word. Kuhn would love it. But I feel like if we can't sublate those contradictions ideologically, explicitly, then Hegel says that spirit can't really come forward at that level of concretion. So if we can get the Cardinals, if we can't get the Pope to come, like we already had a connection to Sadhguru, so we're going to get the Hindus to come with Sadhguru and his 5 million followers. We're going to try and get we had one woman in Pakistan who met the Dalai Lama, and she's going to try and bring him. If we had this big round table about universal logic with all the heavyweights coming to the U of A, restructuring the U of A, and then launching it with Slavoj Žižek, bringing in the Marxists and sublating the Marxists and finishing that project, then we really are going to take all these opposites that can't get along, and we're going to really actually get back to the true universality that Catholicism was supposed to be about. But there's a moment here. I know you got to go to your MMA training, but I feel like there's a shocking thing that it'll shake things up a bit. So I want to have more conversations, and if Zizek can be a part of these after we have a couple of just us and our crew and work out how best to communicate, because we only really get one shot. If we ruin the Slavoj Žižek thing, then who knows when the next one will happen. But yeah, there are some things that Hegel say that are hard to understand that has to get into the Catholic mentality. And I want to pass it by you guys to see how best to communicate that. So whenever you're open next, I would love to chat again. And whether it's in private or whether it's on May 5th, where we're going to be testing this classroom and seeing if we can do live performances and all this. Yeah, I felt like your spirit was pure, and I feel blessed that you're the person that Eric put me in touch with. So, and now we have Slavoj Žižek potentially on the go. So yes, let me know what your heart says to do next, and I will be here. I'm not getting a job for the next 4 weeks, so if we can get something started in the next 4 weeks, then yeah, I'll be going 100% full blast.
It's great to hear. Yeah, definitely blessed to meet you too. I think we get along quite well, and should meet in person next. Do you like cigars?
No, I don't smoke. I'm a vegan. I wish though. Why you smoke cigars?
In fact, I used to work in the cigar industry for 7 years.
Wow, that is surprising. That's got to be an interesting story. Yeah,
Well,
go ahead, go ahead.
I was saying, in fact, most of my job just consisted of smoking cigars for people all day, and then when there were no customers, I just smoked cigars, drank whiskey, and read philosophy and wrote philosophy papers. So it's the best because I just got to meditate and think and write. And so it was actually a really incredible time. But I asked because yeah, normally I usually meet people at the cigar lounge. You don't have
Wow.
to smoke, but that's an option, or we can go somewhere else.
No, no, no. I want to come into your world. Once my legs get healed up here, which will probably happen in the next couple of days because I'm recovering from the hunger strike. Yeah, I'll easily be able to walk or send me the address. And if our next rendezvous can be there, I would love to see what kind of setup you have. I think it's funny. Catholic cigar is not a visual I usually have.
Yeah, actually, the funny thing is for Catholic theologians, it's actually kind of a stereotype of us. I've had
Really?
a ton of cigars with theologians and priests.
Wow. I had no idea the inner world. I haven't really been in the inner world, but I feel ready. And I feel like it's home. It feels like a weird, there's something very interesting going on there. Rome keeps coming to mind. Like it feels like home. It's a weird transformation. But yeah, I did not know that. Thank you for telling me. And I don't know if I'll have one with you. I don't know if I'll partake in the tradition, but I will definitely join you in the philosophizing 110%. That's why you're so good. Like,
Yeah, that's experiencing the otherness. You don't have to, but I will, but it's still a connection.
I love it. Yeah, I'm really impressed by how much you can pull in from other traditions. You can tell you're very well read, and I think that's why people come. So I feel like this is divine intervention, and if we can pick up in your lounge, yeah, I think the connection is going to deepen. Cool.
Absolutely. In fact, one that you mentioned Rome, by the way,
Oh, jealous.
I'm studying at the Angelicum at the Vatican. So I'll be living there for about 8 months. But
Is it?
yeah, I'm looking forward to it. By the way, I did actually work for Pope Francis once. I did when he was in Edmonton, I worked for him.
Oh
Um,
my gosh. Is this
the
divine?
only issue with him is just that his health is really bad right now. So I don't know if you'd be able to make the trip, but they're in the Vatican. As an insider, I can tell you, but in the Vatican, there's already stirrings over politics and who's going to be the next one. All these kinds of stuff from the Cardinals is going on right now. But yeah,
Perfect timing. Oh my goodness. Okay, well, let's get on. Whatever you feel called to do. There are some shocking things in nuclear dialectics, we call them, on the way. So those are what I want to test when we go to the lounge. And then we'll see if the spirit can get us through. And if that clicks, then yes, I think spirit, the next level of spirit is going to happen. And whatever we can actualize at that level, we'll be careful, obviously, and respectful. But we do need spirit to come on the scene very quickly, even just for general suffering. But now this, I can't even believe the AI thing. But yes, let me know if it feels right to you. Give me, well, I don't know what I was going to say, give me a couple of days to recover here. But then the spirit like spoke to me and said, no, no, maybe that's too late. I don't know. So I'm just going to say I'm open to anything. If you have a dream tonight or wherever you feel like doing next, just message me. Do you have my email?
no, can you message it to me on Instagram?
Yeah, I can send that to you. I barely use Instagram too, so I thought that was an interesting. I'm glad they made me download it for my hunger strikes.
Yeah, well, I'm banned on Facebook and most other things. only really have Instagram and Twitter.
Wow, you gotta tell me why that's happening. I got shadow banned a couple of times. We went viral like 4 times already with New World Spirit, and these platforms are really trying to come down, but I haven't crossed over. So that's why, if you want to send me this video, I'll put it on my channel, and maybe I'll get Airvolt to put it on his, or if you know him better than me, then I think we have enough. If you edit it and you make it so that you think you can trust it out there, then yeah, I can try and promote you. But I do want to figure out why they banned you, and then get into the real like praxis and theory. There's a couple nuclear dialectics on the theory side we gotta get through, and then on the praxis side, I think that's when it's gonna get fun, actually. But okay,
Well, I could tell you right now why.
okay.
Because of who I talked to. So we did one episode. I don't know if Eric maybe told you this or not, but we did an episode with Alexander Dugin.
Yeah, that sounds, yeah, the Russian guy.
Yeah, and I ended up getting a visit from CSIS over it.
Oh, whoa.
This was a couple months before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and they're like, okay, so they approached me at Southgate Mall, actually, of all places, and like, because of your friendship with Dugin, and Dugin is the guy who wrote the books on geopolitics in Russian universities that outlines how to invade Ukraine, basically, and he has the ear of Putin. His daughter just got assassinated
Yes.
2 months ago, actually, in a car bomb.
Hmm.
And me and Dugan actually get along very well, but we actually didn't even have a conversation about politics. We were talking about political Platonism. We were talking about different civilizations, how they reached the one transcendent God through their own unique expression. So that's what we were talking about. But regardless, it earned me a visit from
Jeez. Well, you're not alone. Actually, I also got a visit from Canada's anti-terrorist group called INSET. I wonder if they were INSET agents. Canada's Integrated National Security Enforcement Team. They're national and federal, or they're provincial and federal. And so they actually came to my hunger strike and they gave me their card. They were in a undercover truck, and I looked at it and they were laughing at me, and I'm like, "Are you guys kicking me out?" And they're like, "No, no, no." I said, "You are by an airport, just letting you know that." I said, "Yeah, I came by the airport because I wanted the planes to see me as they were landing." And so they were really kind to me, but in a way, I was worried that I got on the Interpol list and I was going to get tracked whenever I traveled. So I did this huge RCMP FOIP request, and it's like, I put 1,700 hours into this lawsuit. I wasn't sure how deep I should get into it on the channel, but I would love to do a whole episode about that and say, like, if you take this path to change the world, this sick system will come after you, and you just have to stay loving. And so, yeah, I'm actually in the same boat as you, that I got a couple of visits too because of my activism. And actually, the reason why I got to stay on the university campus and do these hunger strikes is because for 20 years, not a single criminal offense was filed against me. Everything was peaceful. And when the head of threat detection at the U of A, the head of campus security, were like doing background checks on me, they came out and visited me and said, "Mark, we were going to form you," which means like detain you and send you off to the hospital and get a psych assessment, all that. "But we saw your record and we believe you. We believe that you are a peaceful activist and you will stay that way. We just need to know your full plan. So you have like 8 more of these hunger strikes, blah, 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 blah." But I have a pretty extensive record. And when I tried to get it printed by the RCMP, they said it was going to take months to print it because there was so much. So I feel your pain, my friend. This is real. We're now crossing over into real change making. And as long as we speak in sublation, that's how you are protected. You bring the spirit out of the agents behind the scenes, and you keep sending the power of the word out. You just keep sending it, or else you'll get shot in the chest like Gandhi or JFK or whatever. And so very, very aware that if it's happening to you already, well, I'm going there with you. So fearless. Well,
You gotta be fearless and loving. It's been happening to me for years, but yeah, fearless and loving, that's the way you gotta get through it. Anytime you're trying to do something good and true and beautiful, that's what you're gonna get. And it's just par for the course.
yeah.
Or else you wouldn't be doing it, because there'd be nothing to be fighting for. The good, the true, and the beautiful.
Ooh,
Things would simply be good, true, and beautiful.
I'm getting shivers. Ooh, that felt right. That felt spirited. We need some cardinals and archbishops on board to protect us. I'm sure they have some connections.
Yeah, I mean, like, it'd probably be easy to get Archbishop Richard Smith, actually.
Here in Edmonton?
Archbishop. He's actually does a lot of speaking things. He's a very, very good guy.
Oh.
Yeah, I was also going to say, by the way, on Zizek, I'll just say, I've gotten him to agree to talk to me once, so I could probably do it again. So
Wow.
I think we'll be good for getting him.
Yeah, invite the Archbishop to the cigar lounge. We'll have a chat there, and then and then we'll do Zizek right after. I feel like there's potential here, and I felt it with Ervil too, but for some reason we didn't connect. I think I negated him too much. I don't know. But he also feels pretty pure to me. And also Chris Langan. I'm in Chris Langan's inner circle, and he's a hardcore. I don't know if he's Catholic though. I think he's Protestant. And he might be how we unite the Protestants in with this. But yeah, there's a lot of potential here, and I would love to see what your spirit thinks to do next. Just let me know. I'm feeling a little bit guilty from taking you from planning for these 20 young men. Maybe there are like little army of like super learners. I feel like you're attracting some pretty hardcore dudes. If you're like this on the air, I imagine that.
Basically, what it is, it's called the Brotherhood of St. George,
Mm.
and what we are, I'm the founder of it, the leader of it at the moment. When I moved to Rome for a few months, I want to pass it to somebody else within the group, but I'm not sure if they're ready for that yet. But basically, what it is, it's a Catholic fraternity, and what we do is try to aim to become Catholic men of virtue so that we can serve the community and the church. And what we do is, so we can do a cigar social, of course, once a month, and that's so everyone gets to know each other, frankly, and they can talk to each other without feeling too much pressure. And so the point behind that is so that we can support each other's businesses and network and create like a safety net, because the way things are going, that way that there's a community that has each other, which is what we're meant to live as, basically. And then the formation events, so that's tonight. We do the spiritual formation for the first hour and a half. So we discuss a different virtue or aspect of spirituality, and then we talk about it in our own lives and pray together, then have a candid conversation about what we might be struggling with and how we can help each other. And then after that is the hour and a half physical formation, which is strength training, MMA, boxing, Muay Thai, Kyokushin, karate, all kinds of things, whatever I feel like teaching them at the moment, basically. And yeah, it's going quite well, but the guys are all very committed. In fact, on Tuesday was the feast day of our patron saint, St. George. We went to the St. George Ukrainian Catholic Church, so they have a different rite than Roman, but they're still Catholic. And then they gave us priest gave us a special blessing in Mass. We all got to go up to the altar with candles and all that. It's very special. But yeah, the men's group is great. You should come out sometime.
We have very strong parallels. Like I'm hosting the Ever Living meeting tonight at 7, and I was almost thinking maybe I should go, but part of me is thinking that if I'm still weak, maybe I'll come to. When's the next one?
So they're every month. The cigar social is the second Saturday of the month, and the formation night is the fourth Saturday of the month.
Okay, you guys are pretty busy. Well, I definitely want to come to one of them. Maybe we'll test the nuclear dialectics in the lounge, me, you, and if the Archbishop guy wants to come, for sure. See how that goes, because that's where there's like a deeper aspect to Hegel, and I'm really curious to see how you guys are going to handle it, and maybe you can help me understand it even a little bit better. But that's what I want to test the waters first before getting wider, and then if it's stable spirit, if it really does connect, then we're off to the races. So yeah, that, and then I will definitely come, because I need to strengthen my body a little bit for the next hunger strike in 2 months. And then your program of building them up is very smart. Like you're going through what we call the life areas. You're doing it all, very comprehensive, which I love. I absolutely love that. So I feel like supporting, like I feel like you got something good going on, and supporting these young men. So like Jordan Peterson is kind of trying to do, very charged topic, but a lot of these men are being left behind. And we're about to go through a global economic collapse, according to JP Morgan Chase, which is going to make it even harder. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, we're in for a doozy. So the sooner the better. Yeah, you let me know what works for you guys in the lounge. And my legs are getting stronger, so I will be able to travel here. Just let me know next couple of days, and I'll meet you where you guys are. And I will take the next step of destiny together.
Sounds good. And thank you for the kind words, by the way, about what we're doing. And actually, we'll gladly help you with the healing process. Some of our guys, like we have a guy with a kinesiology background and sports science, and so we know all the stuff about proper rehab and strength training and all kinds of stuff to make it so you're all good for the next one.
I feel blessed. I feel like I feel like there's so much goodness. I almost feel like, whoa, um, I'm almost speechless here. We'll see how it goes on we'll call it like the nuclear cigar session or something. But I'm very excited for it now. I actually think it's going to go really well. So let me know, and I have my U pass. I can travel anywhere with the public transit, and then I'll make it just easy for you if you're at your cigar shop. I will come check it out, and hopefully this week if possible. But of course, you're probably busier than me. I'm just sitting here lounging about, planning things, eating food. Food is bliss right now. In fact, right after we hang up the phone here, I'm gonna go and make a nice bowl of food that my sister just bought me, some vegan food. So I'm not sure what your guys' opinions are on veganism, but that might be another nuclear dialectic we'll get into at the cigar lounge.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm sure the food must feel really nice right
Oh man, it's like heaven on earth. The simplest things, like breaking bread. I now know why that's not only important metaphysically, but like it's just tasty when you're hungry. Like simple, plain bread tastes amazing. And I actually baked my own here, so I'm gonna go cut myself a couple of slices and break some bread with myself.
now. I'll
So,
break bread with you in spirit. I'll let you go here and get some nourishment.
okay, I appreciate you, Tyler. Have a wonderful, fantastic, beautiful day. And I sent you my email, so let me know the next steps as soon as they come to you.
Sounds good. I'll talk to you later.
All right, my friend. Take care. What a beautiful human being.